Alright, Chapter 14, Part 3. So for this last section for Chapter 14, we'll go over the special senses as well as our cranial nerves. For the special senses, they are senses that are limited to the head and have very complex sense organs to be able to receive that sensory information. So for your special senses, they're vision, hearing, equilibrium, taste, and smell. So for your vision, your primary visual cortex is found in the farthest posterior region of your occipital lobe. So if you've ever gotten hit with the basketball or just gotten hit in the back of your head really hard and you start seeing stars, it's because that area of your brain has actually been activated, and so your brain interprets that activation just from that contact hit as as some kind of information getting sent in, and so it just makes up something in response to that activation. So in order to make sense of what we're seeing, so understanding what we're seeing and recognizing it, is through our visual association area, which is anterior to our primary visual cortex. So it occupies our remaining occipital lobe. So again, the lobe that's in the back of our skull, or back of the brain. So it helps us with making sense of what we see, as well as part of our association area being in our temporal lobe region. So the inferior or bottom part helps us to recognize faces as well as familiar objects. Our next special sense is hearing. So hearing comes into our brain. So here's our external acoustic meatus, ear canal. The information comes through, sent right to our primary auditory cortex in the temporal lobe, as well as part of your insular cortex. Your association areas also are near to that auditory cortex area. So our association area helps us determine what we heard. So it helps us to recognize spoken words, familiar pieces of music, as well as voices on the phone. So recognizing who is speaking. Our next special sense is the equilibrium, so dealing with our being able to stay balanced and upright. Also helps us to determine being able to sense motion. So by using head movements as well as eye movements, helps us to determine our balance and our position in space. Also helps us with, for example, tracking of an object. So, for example, if you're hunting and you're tracking, let's say if you're hunting rabbits, able to track that rabbit across your field of vision without getting dizzy. Also is involved with different visceral functions, so functions in your more internal organs. So that's why you kind of get nauseous when you get dizzy. It's because there's that connection there. The association cortex for your equilibrium is found in the roof of the lateral sulcus near the lower end of the central sulcus. So the sulcus that separates your temporal lobe from your parietal and frontal lobes. So we're talking in that area right there. So it allows for that information for us to determine our body's movement as well as, again, our orientation in space. So where we are. Are we standing upright? Are we laying down? Are we upside down? Able to determine where we are in space. The last special sense is taste and smell. So we have our taste signals, which are gustatory. So these are through the taste buds on your tongue going to the primary gustatory cortex at the inferior end of our post-central gyrus in the parietal lobe, and in the anterior region of our insular cortex. The olfactory, which is our smell, again comes from your olfactory chamber. So you're in your nasal region. You have these nerve extensions that extend into your nasal chamber, and it's actually your only nerve endings that are exposed to the outside environment. So when these nerve endings detect particles in the air that you breathe. Those particles are then have a particular code for them, where that information is then sent to the primary olfactory cortex, which is in the temporal lobe as well as part of your frontal lobe. So basically, information coming in through your nose and then straight to inferior part of your frontal lobe as well as part of your temporal lobe. The last sense we'll talk about is our general senses. So this is just more generic information from our outside, from our more exterior surfaces of our body. So that's our skin as well as our muscles. So they're over your entire body. Very simple receptors, so not very complicated like your parts that helps you determine your hearing. So not only channeling the ear into the sound into your ear, but also having the eardrum and then the little bones inside your ear. And then there's a complex structure that helps determine what you actually heard. So is it a high-pitched sound? Is it a low-pitched sound? So that, very complex. Your eyeballs, very complex. So your taste buds, fairly complex. So all those having more complex type of receptors and sensory information versus with your general senses, your sense is your touch, or senses is based on just generic, okay, how strong of a sense is this and where is it? So wherever you, for example, are touched, then that information goes to a particular location in your cerebral cortex. And then how strong of a sensation is based on the coding of that signal. So if it's a harder touch like a pinch, then you're going to send more action potentials because you're activating more of those touch receptors. So you're going to send more action potentials. So it's a faster repetition of signal than, for example, a light touch like someone gently stroking your hand. So for your general senses, that's touch, pressure, stretch, movement, heat, cold, and pain. Some of your cranial nerves can also carry general sensory information. So for example, the touch on your face. For the rest of the body, the ascending tract, so going up toward your brain, will carry information from the contralateral side. So it's the opposite side of that brain, opposite side of the body sends information to the opposite side of the brain. So for example, left side of the body, right side of the brain. Right side of the body, left side of the brain. So in order to get to your brain, it has to pass through the thalamus and the diencephalon region. So go from our brain stem. There's some processing there as well as more processing in the diencephalon regions. It will relay that signal to what's called the postcentral gyrus of the parietal lobe. So again, difference between our frontal lobe and parietal lobe. So you have your central sulcus. Then your post-central sulcus is where your sensory information is going to go. And it's also called your sensory strip. It's not on this page, but oh well. Still, sensory strip is a common way of saying it. Oh, there it is. Right there. Sensory strip. Okay. So it allows us to have the awareness of the stimuli. So even though it gets gated through our brain stem and the thalamus region, once it reaches the cortex, then we're actually aware of that stimuli. Near our sensory strip is our association area, so that helps us to make sense of the information that we receive. So here's a mapped out version of our somatosensory strip. So our postcentral gyrus. So with the mapping of our senses, information comes from one region and gets mapped on a particular spot on our cortex, and that's how we know where that information is coming from. So here at the bottom, you have your abdominal viscera. This is not consciously knowing what those signals are, but that's where their location is. So for example, it's more so signals that we're never going to pay attention to unless there's a problem, usually like pains. For example, if you have like a stomach ache, then you'll actually pay attention to that sensory information. For the rest of the sensory strip, it's stuff that we'll actually pay attention to, so we have conscious control over, or we'll have conscious recognition of exactly where that information is. Our face has a lot of sensory information come in, so it has a lot of space on that sensory strip. It's particularly the mouth and tongue region. So this is why we kiss our partner, because it's a lot of sensory information being exchanged with our partner. Our hands have a lot of sensory information, so that's why babies touch everything and why they put stuff in their mouth, because they're getting that sensory information, trying to tell their brain, hey, what is this object that I'm holding? Rest of your body, not much. Feet a little bit more, just because as you're walking, helping you to determine, are you sure-footed where you're stepping? And then due to development, since our genitals are the last things to be mapped out and developed, then they're just kind of like stuck on the end. So that's why some people have that sexual stimulation from their feet, because there's a little bit of cross wiring from them being right there next to each other in that location. So this little map of the guy is called our sensory homunculus. Very similar to our sensory information is our motor command. So it starts off in our motor association area, which is in front of our precentral gyrus. So our central gyrus is located here. Then our precentral gyrus, that's our motor strip. And then our association area is in front of that. And that is the area that develops the plan on how we're going to move the muscles in order to make whatever movement we're going to make. So that plan is our program for our sequence of muscle contraction of how we're going to do whatever movement we're going to. That program is then sent to our precentral gyrus, so that motor strip right in front of the central sulcus. That motor strip is what's going to command those muscles to move. So just like our sensory strip, our motor strip also has a mapping on that piece of cortex. So here we still have another homunculus, but now it is the motor homunculus. So going from still just most of your body around, going toward this more medial aspect. Hand having a lot of representation because you have very complex movements with your hands. Face having a lot of mapping area because you're making different facial expressions, as well as your tongue having a lot of mapping because it's used in making of speech, helping you swallow, helping you to moving around your food as you're trying to digest it. So very complex movements with your tongue, so having a lot of representation. So with your command from your motor strip, the neurons send that information from your cortex, and then that's called your upper motor neurons, and they synapse onto lower motor neurons in the brainstem or spinal cord. So as they're going in a descending track from the cortex, they will cross over or desiccate to the contralateral side. So same thing like sensory information, opposite side of the body, opposite side of the brain. Okay, so they'll synapse onto the lower motor neurons. Those lower motor neurons are going to be the ones that are going to send that command to the particular skeletal muscle. So with your motor control, other areas of the brain are also involved. So for example, the basal nuclei and your cerebellum. Next special function of the brain is looking at language. So being able to interpret what we see and hear into a pattern for making of words and eventually creating language. So language includes several abilities. So being able to read a language, write what you're trying to communicate, speak it verbally, or use hand signals to speak it in a way, as well as being to understand words. So important areas for language are Wernicke's area, which is located in the left hemisphere. So by your lateral sulcus, so right above your temporal lobe, right here in the back, that region there. It allows us to recognize spoken and written language. So for our sign language type of language, that information comes from our occipital lobe. that information is still sent to Wernicke's area to understand that language. If we're going to reply or just speak something, then that Wernicke's area will create the phrases that we're going to speak and then send that information to the next area, which is Broca's area. So Broca's area is in your association cortex for motor command. It will create your motor program or your plan of what muscles need to move in order for you to say particular words or to be able to sign those words. So, for example, in sign language. So it's going to send that information to your primary motor cortex, which is right next door, so your motor strip. Then your motor strip is going to command those muscles to move. So here's our little pathway for our information. So hearing of language, seeing of language sent to Wernicke's area. Then if we're going to reply or just make up some words that we want to say, so sometimes you might even visualize what you're going to say or speak to yourself what you're going to say. Those words and phrases that you're going to use, that information is sent to Broca's area. Broca's area will make the motor plan for telling which specific muscles are going to move in order for you to say or sign what you want to say. So, for example, tongue region and some of your face region being in this location, or there should be another arrow going up to the hand region if you're using sign language. Here's a more simplified version of that pathway. So, visual cortex, auditory cortex into Wernicke's area, then to Broca's area for the motor plan, sent to our precentral gyrus to command the muscles to produce your speech. So the last section is the cranial nerves. So cranial nerves extend from your brain stem. There's 12 of them, each of them having their own name as well as their own number. So showing here, extending off from the brain stem, the parts in yellow. Your cranial nerves have both sensory and motor functions, so either taking sensory information to the brain or sending out motor commands to certain areas. Again, these are functions that are located in the head and neck region. So some of your cranial nerves have only sensory information coming in, some only send motor information out, and some have both a sensory and motor component. So for our study, instead of going through all 12 of them, we'll actually go through just these few. So actually 6 of them. So it's only half. So for our selected cranial nerves, we have the olfactory for smell, which is number 1. Number 2, optic for vision. Number 5, which is the trigeminal nerve, which is our face sensory one. Number 7, which is facial, which is a motor and sensory of the face. Number 8, the vestibular cochlear nerve. And then number 10, which is your vagus nerve. So the first one, olfactory nerve. So kind of remembering which number that is. You have one nose, so olfactory, your cranial nerve, number 1. Its job is to transmit the scent signals. So as you're breathing in air into your nasal chambers, those particles that are in the air will make contact with these nerve endings on that extend off of your olfactory nerve. So again, exposed to the outside environment. The information is sent to the olfactory bulb, where a pattern based on that smell is coded, and then that information is sent to the brain. So sent to your sensory strip in the parietal lobe. Next one, the optic nerve. So think 2 eyeballs. Let's do it this way. 2 eyeballs. So it's cranial nerve number 2. So these send your vision signals. So light comes into your eyeball, hits the back of your eyeball, which is called your retina. Your retina is going to receive the light signals coming through our eye, transmit that information to this area here, which is called your optic chiasm. So remember earlier, the suprachiasmatic nucleus is above that, so more superior to that. So this is going to send information. So this is the left eyeball is going to Some of it's going to cross over to our right occipital lobe. Some of it's going to stay on the same side. So again, this is how we're able to have depth perception, because we're getting information from both eyeballs. Next nerve is a trigeminal nerve. So it has a sensory and motor component. So it's most of the sensory of the face, as well as commanding the jaw muscles to move. Cranial nerve number 7 is also a motor and sensory, so more of your face muscles for your motor, and part of your taste from your tongue is sent to the brain. So the next one's kind of one of your special ones, kind of cool one as well. At least I think so. So this is your vestibular cochlear nerve, your cranial nerve number 8. So think of it like as your little cochlear here. Well, cochlear and semicircular ducts kind of look like the number 8. So as sound comes in, hits those eardrums, moves those inner ear bones, and then that sound is transmitted to your cochlear for hearing. So leaving your cochlear, and then will combine, and after a little bit with your other nerve from the vestibule region here, and will combine into the vestibular cochlear nerve. So these semicircular ducts are in different orientations in space. So as you tilt your head, it helps you to realize where you are in space. So being able to keep your balance of knowing where your head is at. The last special cranial nerve that we'll look at is the vagus nerve. So I remember this one thinking like Las Vegas in Nevada, where you have that main strip in Vegas with all the hotels and casinos on the outside of them, so on the side of those strip. So this major nerve actually is involved with a lot of the functions of your cardiac, pulmonary, digestive, as well as urinary functions. There's 2 branches to this, so actually if you cut both of them, it's actually fatal, because you're not having a function for these areas. So it actually greatly inhibits them. So that's it for Chapter 14.